I couldn't help but notice that you've clicked on and are presently listening to an episode of the Paranormal Patio podcast. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your support. And if you want to continue to support us, the best thing you can do is share our episodes on social media. That's right. You can tag us in everything. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find us on paranormalpatio.com, where you'll find articles, links to information from our past guests, as well as, every episode as it comes out. Also, head on over to Patreon. Patreon.com/BeyondThePatio. You can get a monthly live stream, at least one. Sometimes we do more. Exclusive bonus content, early access to all of our episodes. And starting with Season 3, I've got to move Season 1 to the archives. So they'll be on Patreon as well, and you can listen to them there. Thanks again for your support. And hey, let's get into the episode. What kind of weird thing are we talking about today? On this episode, we're going to be speaking with Courtney Block, the Liminal Librarian, on Instagram. And I think on Twitter. At any rate, this is a great conversation about researching. If you're a paranormal researcher, maybe you just have one specific thing that you've been looking into and studying for a while and you're kind of hit a roadblock, some good tips on where to find information, good resources. Also, we're going to talk about libraries themselves, and I'm going to get on a soapbox a little bit and probably embarrass myself. But hey, that's what you come for. To listen to me embarrass myself for an hour every other week. On a less lighthearted note, this episode was recorded during a moderate rain that we had here at the patio. And so the audio does have some pitter-patter of rain. Because of that, I am adding extra rain to distract you from the real rain. So the fake rain is there to make it seem a little less strenuous to listen to. And there were a few audio artifacts that kind of showed up in this interview that were a little bizarre. It does happen from time to time. Typically, it doesn't. But the weirder the topic is usually like there's an equivalent level, And this was not really the case in this interview, which is odd. However, I think it's pretty listenable, and I think you'll enjoy it. Courtney Block, the Liminal Librarian, here to talk about all things library. And if you enjoy this conversation, head over to Patreon because I'm also uploading around 10 minutes or so of bonus audio from this episode. And I think you'll like that too. Patreon.com/BeyondThePatio.
You're listening to the Paranormal Patio Podcast.
Welcome back to Paranormal Patio. As always, I'm Jason, joined tonight by the Liminal Librarian herself. That's right. I have the foremost authority on the spookiness of libraries right here in the Paranormal Patio. Ladies and gentlemen, Courtney Block, welcome to the patio.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I think that is the first time I've ever been referred to as the foremost authority on anything. And I love that it's spooky libraries. I want that to just be my vibe forever.
That's the vibe that I got, before we ever talked online. And so I'm just going to roll with it. And I feel like the position that I'm in to dictate things that people will automatically believe without looking into them is perfect for launching this very idea of you being the foremost authority of spooky libraries.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here. I'm just happy to chat and see where it goes.
Yeah, we've been talking for almost an hour already, and we decided to finally go ahead and start the episode because we're missing out probably on all kinds of great stuff. So even though it's fun for the two of us, you're listening to this at home or on your way to work, and you don't have a clue about this conversation. So we're going to go ahead and actually do a proper Paranormal Patio episode, as proper as they come. We'll have a lot more discussion, I am sure. So before we get into it too deep, can you give everybody at home or wherever they are a little background on yourself, who you are, what you do, and why you think that I think you are the foremost authority on spooky libraries.
Oh, wow. Okay, yes, I'm happy to. So, yeah, I'm Courtney. I am an academic librarian. Before I was in academia, I worked in public libraries. I love everything about libraries and the many different ways that they serve communities. I'm also an author. My first book came out in June of 2020, so in a pandemic, and that was titled Researching the Paranormal by published by Rowman and Littlefield, and I'm working on my second book now, which is a beginner's guide, a beginner's foray into the realm of parapsychology. So both of my books combine what I do as a librarian, which is, locate things, collate them, put them together in a digestible, consumable form for people. So both of them are basically just really big annotated bibliographies about resources that you can find that talk about a whole variety of paranormal topics, key figures in, for instance, the history of parapsychology, and also modern figures. Why I think you call me the foremost expert on spooky libraries. I think because, we had a great conversation about the intersection of the paranormal and liminality and libraries. I think I just, I talk openly about the paranormal, and I also talk very openly about librarianship, and I talk quite frequently about the various intersections among those two. And so maybe that's why you use that phrase.
I had to have a little fun with that. We have to kind of start out on a good, positive, fun little note before we get weird so that the change is much more noticeable, right?
Sounds great.
It's all strategy. We started talking on Instagram. I had put out a little feeler for some guests. I had a few spots to fill for the rest of the year. And even though you're listening to this episode in probably late January or February, this is actually being recorded before Christmas. And this is the last episode for me to record for 2021. So cheers to 2022. And hopefully when you're listening to this, the world is a little bit better than it is right now. I hesitate to say things couldn't get any worse, and I feel like we're kind of bouncing back a little bit, but at the same time, every day could go either direction. So hopefully this little time capsule here, you will open it and find that you are in the graceful arms of fairer weather. And 2022, we're here for you if you're here for us. Off my soapbox.
No. That was such a lovely way. That's such a lovely way of putting it. And I'm very grateful and humbled to round out your year of recordings, and just, really grateful that you put out that feeler on Instagram and that we could be chatting here today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for reaching out and coming on. And you said, hey, I wrote this book about how to properly research paranormal topics and things. And so I thought that is perfect, because not only is it interesting to people who listen to my show, it could potentially be incredibly useful for myself, for my personal research. And so, why not have you on the show? It's a no-brainer. And here you are. Let's dig in a little bit. Before we start talking about the fun, spooky stuff, let's talk about the practicality of how you define researching the paranormal, and some good tips that you would have for someone who maybe they think there's a ghost in their house and they want to know who it is and how they died and all this good stuff.
That is such an amazing question. Yeah, let's dig into it. So the topic of researching the paranormal, I got really interested in that for a number of reasons. So to take it, really far back, I've always been interested in the paranormal. Probably many of us have since childhood. I love so many stories that people have where they talk about how the first like spooky stories that they read were because they found a book in a library. And as a librarian, I love libraries. And people in any role that I have like played in various types of libraries have always been interested in the paranormal, and they always will come up to you at the reference desk, at the research desk, and say, hey, I'm interested in ghosts, or I'm interested in cryptids or aliens or whatever, you know, and I'll help them find resources. And that didn't stop when I transitioned from public to academic libraries. What I noticed, though, is that when students would approach me at the academic library that I work at, a couple of really interesting things would happen. They would approach and say that they were interested in doing a paper or finding research about maybe ghosts, for instance. One of two things would happen. They would say that they were sorry, like they would actually apologize, and they would say things like, this is probably so silly, and there's probably no research out there on this, and I'm probably going to have to change my topic, but this is what I'm interested in. Yeah, so like they would apologize, or they would automatically just say things like, well, this is what I'm interested in, but I know there's nothing serious about it, so can you just like help me find a new topic? And I got to thinking about those instances and how unfortunate it is that anybody should feel silly for having an interest in the paranormal, especially in institutions of higher education, which should be open-minded about letting people explore, like, you know, any topic, really, like how to sort of like take your curiosity and apply it, right? Like that's what it's all about. And also, too, I thought it was really unfortunate that there was this assumption that there was no research about these topics, which is just totally untrue and wipes out like hundreds of years worth of people that have engaged in very critical, very scientific, very creative ways about the paranormal. And so, yeah, it manifested into my first book, where I talk about the ways in which you can locate these resources. I include a ton of them in the book with annotations so you know what they're all about. I think the biggest thing is this notion of credibility, right? Which is important for anything that you consume, whether it's in the context of being a student writing a research paper or just anybody just looking something up, let's say on Google, because you're curious about it, right? Like critically looking at things like, who is the author? Do they tell us where they get their information? Is this a blog? Is it a personal experience? Like, what is happening here, right? And so it's much less about the practical aspects of being, let's say, a boots on the ground paranormal investigator, like at a haunted location. But I do have a chapter about that. And it's more so, my first book is more so a conversation about how do you locate the research that has been done by generations and generations of people before, and that is still currently being done by, you know, this modern iteration of paranormal research.
I like to lump myself into that category, but it's very narrow because I only research the thing that I am personally working on. So right. I know what I do. You know, I've utilized a few websites that have been incredibly fruitful. It's really good to look at the family tree type services like Ancestry, newspapers.com, and also the this is I don't think it's an ethical bridge, but the county tax maps to look at names of who owns this property now, who paid taxes on this last year. I mean, it's public information. You know, you don't want to just harass people or whatever, but I found myself earlier this year, back in the spring, needing to visit some places that were, I didn't know if they were private or public land, you know what I mean? And so I had to look it up, and that was the only thing I could think of, was to pull up a tax map and say, oh, okay, this is the spot, and it is owned privately, and, you know, reach out to those people. And so those have helped a lot. Also, more focused on the paranormal side of it is the findagrave.com to look at who's buried in what cemetery. And a lot of times, you know, you can get a lot of information just from that, because there'll be a picture of the tombstone, and it's oftentimes a typewritten version of what is on the stone if you can't really read it in the picture. Definitely, those have been my most utilized resources as I've been digging into the mystery that is Livingston County, Kentucky, for my upcoming documentary. Listeners of the show, I'm still working on it. Get off my back. Turns out making a documentary is a lot harder than I thought it was. Those are some of the things that I use. Could you guide me into some more steps that I could take to look into things beyond what I've already done?
Yes. All of those things are amazing. I love the Find a Grave website. Like you said, it's very user-friendly, and I love that there is often a picture associated with the person that you might be looking up, like of the tombstone. Every now and then you might also see like a portrait or something, and there's just that energetic connection when you see that. That is so cool, and I love using it in my own research. But yeah, all of the things that you mentioned, and I think in addition, there are also, you know, scores of different databases that you can look into. You can always use Google Scholar if you are interested in maybe some of the science or theory or thought behind hauntings and the paranormal. And what's really cool about reading some of those resources is that a lot of them involve experimental designs and studies, and you can read about how the people in that article set up a paranormal study, and you can get inspiration from that and learn how to set up your own. So that's pretty cool. Newspaper databases, I know newspapers.com is a really great one. Historical newspaper archives as well. A lot of these you might have to access through a library because a lot of databases, of course, are going to be subscription-based. But what I wish more people knew is that libraries do provide access to those things. Like Ancestry.com, so many libraries provide access to that. If you just go like sign up and get a library card. Heritage Quest, I think, is another one. There's also tons of local history and state history resources that are going to be provided by your libraries. Like here in Indiana, there's a database called Indiana Memory, and you can actually, I think anybody can actually just go to it and look it up. And essentially, it is designed to digitize the physical archival collections in libraries. And so you'll get, like registries of like poor farms, for example, or letters from people, or, marriage records, and just, you never know what you're going to find. And so those are just some of the other things that you can use. You can also use plat maps, PLAT, to research maybe who owned the property that maybe you're living on currently. And those are just some of the many other things that you can use.
Good tips. For those of us who may not have direct access to a library, myself included, raise your hands if you live in the middle of nowhere. I see some of you. We have at least 4 public libraries in the county, but where I live specifically, we do not have a library. So for those folks who do not live near a library or do not have access to a library, what are some library-esque resources that you would recommend? Obviously, mine would be Scribd, SCRIBD.com.
Yes.
You do have to pay for it, but there's just tons of information on there.
I love that website. I have found some things for my books that I couldn't like immediately access through my various library connections, and they do offer like a week or so, I think, free if you're new or something, so you can get on there and like, you know, get a bunch of stuff before that runs out. Let's see here, other non-library. I mean, I think that Google Scholar is like great if you're looking for some research stuff. If you are, newspapers.com is another great one. Again, a paid resource, but I think they also might have like a free trial. And I think that they also offer discounts if you are, let's say, like a student, if you have like a .edu address. Checking the websites of your local historical societies or your state historical society, because there are tons of resources like digitized newspapers or resources like Indiana Memory. I'm sure that your states have some sort of similar, project. The Library of Congress can be a really great resource as well. There is this amazing photograph archive that they have through the Library of Congress, and it's just amazing. And so much of that is freely and openly accessible. So that's another couple resources that are really cool.
You touched on or mentioned something that I'd like to talk about for a second, because I think it's an interesting thing to talk about, and that was historical societies. I don't know about historical societies anywhere else in the entire world except for the one in my county. So this experience may be different than yours, but every person in my historical society is somewhere near the age of 700 years old. And the conservative, highly religious, incredibly Republican mindset of people from that era that are still hanging on, they don't appreciate so much the weirdness, and to them the history has to be practical, or what we in the weirdo circles would call the mundane. I wonder, with your background, and I'm assuming your interactions with various historical societies, is the place where I am common for this type of thing, for these type of people to be the ones that are curating this information? Or are there more, progressive, younger crowds that manage these things somewhere else?
Well, I think that's a really great question. It's a very complex one, because in my experience, I have found that the paranormal is kind of like the great equalizer. Like, everybody has a story to a certain degree. I think I kind of know what you're getting at. Maybe some of these more complex, like high strangeness type of avenue things, some people might get a little weirded out and, I don't know, maybe shut down the conversation. But in general, like the paranormal, like if you're inquiring about, hey, like, have you heard any ghost stories? Like, have you had any heard any strange tales or had any yourself, because you're somebody who's been living in this county for, 7 decades.
70 decades.
Right. Yeah. I think that in general, people are open to talking about it up to a certain point, and that's the experience that I have had. Now, there are always the inevitable person that starts taking it into a very religious conversation. But I guess what I meant is not necessarily seeking out like the people on historical societies, although you certainly can talk to those people, or maybe if they have an email, send them an email and just be like, hey, I'm looking for stories, or this is my house, like, have you heard anything weird or whatever? But I guess what I was getting at is just looking at the resources that they provide, like maybe some special digital collections that might offer you some information about the specific thing that you're looking for. You don't necessarily have to explain yourself, to these people if you're not comfortable or if you think it's going to be met with judgment or animosity. But in my experience, I have not met any resistance or closed-mindedness in a topical approach to the paranormal. Now from academics, that's a bit of a different story.
Sure. I guess my concern is that with the mindset that the people of my area typically have, where all this woo-woo stuff is just garbage. That's never the focus, for these type of places, but it's not a reason to keep something around, whether that be a story or an artifact or a book, whatever. It's something that you hide and you don't talk about. Like, that's the mindset of the area that I live. That people do not talk about these things because everyone thinks that, I don't know, I'm going off on a tangent, but...
No, it's not a tangent. This is good. It's relevant. And it's important.
So, yeah, my concern is just with the curation of the actual information, or and the tangible physical artifacts that exist in these places. The focus is not to provide knowledge and research on the woo-woo. It is, this building was built in 1827 by Ferdinand Bobovich, and it's so dry. And I think that's why everyone that, in my experience, has anything to do with, this group, is whatever you want to call it, historical society, is they're so much older and conservative, and they're products of their time. I'm not judging.
Right.
But because of how they grew up and how they've lived their lives, all of this stuff is just wacko, and they're not going to have any sort of focus on it. And right. That makes me worry about all of the information and artifacts that will have been lost, especially coming into the secondary ramifications of the youth and the young adults who would otherwise be interested in historical narratives and historical information being turned off because of these groups of people all being viewed as, just ancient and different. Right. And so not only do you lose the information that these people write off as nonsense, but you also lose the information that would come from the next generation that is put off by the mindset of the current regime, so to speak.
Right. I think that this is a great question, a great concern, and a complex one. I think that trying to talk to people is very different than engaging with resources and literature of all types, whether it's, newspaper articles, photos, historical records, journal articles, whatever. I think these are two very different things, because you will find very weird things in the historical publications, like historical newspapers or this or that. Like, I was reading a couple weeks ago about like the Kentucky meat shower. Have you heard about this?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
From like the 1800s. It's wild. And so, but you brought up a good point. You absolutely do have to engage with, especially the historical records and artifacts, with an understanding of the context in which those things were written and the historical period and the thoughts that maybe were predominant or the biases that certain people bring to it. You absolutely do have to. I think you're right. I think that there's probably a fair amount of strange experiences that are essentially lost because they haven't been captured in any way, for people to find later on, like let's say in an archive or a database, and maybe they're worried about talking about it, for instance. I think that it probably varies from place to place and topic to topic. I remember when I was at the public library and still at the academic library, I do a lot of paranormal programming. So events that are centered around topics of the paranormal. And I had gone to a library conference when I worked at the public library, and I did a lecture, a little seminar about the ins and outs of paranormal programming in the library. There was somebody who came and they were like, hey, I live in a pretty conservative, area, and I'm just curious, have you had anybody that was really against you having a paranormal programming, you having a ghost investigation, a paranormal investigation group come to your library? They were really worried about getting backlash, and I can totally understand that, and that concern is valid. I never had any negative experience from doing that, like in the public library. I have had a few comments made about what I do in the academic library, but few and far between, and by and large, I feel very supported by my university, but yeah.
Yeah, and really, to double back a little bit, it's not just the weirdo stuff that's being lost. If there's such a generational gap between the finders and the keepers, right? And that generational gap not creates hostility, but it creates this large bridge that no one on either side is willing to cross to meet in the middle. And we're going to lose tons of local historical artifacts just due to that communication gap between generations, because no one who's 14 years old wants to go to a musty old building on the south side of town that the same, 4 old ladies have been in, for the better part of 6 or 7 decades. And it's just not something as a youthful person that you would feel compelled to do unless you just had this overwhelming, burning fire inside of you to learn about your local area. And so, yeah, I worry about the loss of that information across the board, not just the woo-woo and the weird and the fun, but practical, mundane history that these people have. They have tons of knowledge, about the things that are, relevant and interesting to them. The same as you have things and I have things in the same regard. But that information goes away, in the next 20 years when this generation begins to disappear. And because those bridges weren't shortened and those gaps weren't made easier to cross, we now have this entire deficit, of decades of history that will be either forgotten entirely or rediscovered under a different lens and, fallen victim to hearsay and the telephone game and things. Whereas these people that have it now, the keepers, they're not going to be able to stand there and say, no, this is what actually happened. You're wrong about this date, or you're wrong about this person's name, or the relationship they had with this other person, because they haven't been able to effectively reach out and touch the next generation and inspire the next generation. So yeah, it's a real concern that I didn't realize I had until we started talking about it, until you said the words historical society. But I now have this fear of all this information just being lost. And as sickening as it makes me feel, I guess I'm grateful for big internet, because this is the only way that you can engage with other people and not know that they're a 75-year-old dude who hates rap music and is mad at anyone who does anything on Sunday. You know what I mean?
Right.
You don't have to know how someone voted to talk to them on the internet if you're looking into something historical.
Right.
And so I feel like these physical locations are going to be a thing of the past, much like, the mom and pop shops and unfortunately a lot of public libraries. There's this whole generation, generations. I mean, there's multiple generations of history that are just going to disappear in the next 20 or 30 years. But at least we have the internet. And unfortunately, with that comes, you don't know how true what you're reading is.
Right. Well, yeah. And to just sort of pick at that a little bit. There are lots of historical societies that I have come across that do have really wonderful digital collections and resources. So you can engage with a historical society online, and not necessarily have to, go in and talk to anybody per se. Now you certainly can, and if you feel so inspired, you should, because historical society folks just have, wonderful information. Play it by ear based on your comfort level, of course, but there is a ton of information that historical societies provide online, that state libraries have, archives of digitized information that you can research and get your hands on. There are ways to get that information that I think maybe people don't realize, or still have this assumption maybe that historical societies are just, entirely brick and mortar, and you have to go in and go through a 75-year-old gatekeeper to access, and I get that, and I get that that's how it might feel, but yeah, again, like you said, we have big internet, and everybody's realized that. Historical societies, like I mentioned, the Library of Congress has just amazing resources. Your state libraries are going to have amazing resources. If you're looking to drill into those like historical, local resources. And I think that, I feel like it's related, but when you were talking, I was reminded of part of the reason that I felt it was really important to openly be an academic who talks about and writes about the paranormal, and who also embeds the paranormal into the classroom in some classes that I've taught. I think it's important so that people see that weirdness has a place in the academy, so that if they are somebody who is interested in the paranormal, they see me openly talking about and engaging with it, and realize that they don't have to hide that part of themselves, because I feel like, I love what I do, but academia can be a very othering type of place for many people.
Yeah, it's very important that we have people like you that are not even just people with the paranormal, but with whatever relegated specialty that academia would just as soon toss to the bin, that represent those interests in academia, especially with social issues, and people who feel ostracized, finding that one person and, potentially could save their life, if we want to get really morose and deep into the societal impact of having someone there that represents your interest. So,
right.
Yeah, you're doing an important thing, even though it may be to some a very silly thing or nonsense.
Right. Yeah.
It's an appreciated and necessary thing.
Yeah. And I just, I feel like when I jumped from public librarianship over to academia, I was at first a little hesitant to be as open as I had about my interest in the paranormal and my involvement with paranormal research groups and stuff like that. And then I just sort of got to this point where I was like, I'm not interested in hiding that part of myself. And so I did start to openly talk about it. And like I said, for the most part, I feel very supported. Of course, at my university, librarians are tenured. And tenure is like, talk about academia being weird, like tenure is like a very weird aspect of that. And I sort of have my own thoughts and feelings about it. But I do remember like being concerned about like, is somebody going to be on my tenure review committee who knows what I do and is going to, hold it against me because it threatens their materialist worldview,
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say that I did not have anybody that had a problem with it, and I successfully went through tenure this past year, and now I feel I feel that it's even more important for me to be open about these weird aspects of myself now that I have a sort of a sense of protection, if you will. I think it's important now to use that privilege that I have, that privilege being tenure, to be open about high strangeness and people that have an interest in that. Because again, I realized, like, after so many students came up and approached me at the desk, I was like, students have this really interesting way of approaching the paranormal, and it's really kind of unfortunate that they think, A, there's not any credible information or research that has been done, and B, that they think they're scared that I'm gonna judge them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a precedent that's been set for so long, especially in rural areas.
Yeah.
When you move into the cities, all of the things that I have said probably are completely non-existent. But there are more rural communities in this country than there are urban communities in this country. And I think that knowing your sort of place geographically, obviously take everything that I say with a grain of salt, but especially the things that I've said about the sort of feedback and viewpoints I have about my local situation. Take it all with a grain of salt. I really, for some reason, felt compelled to stand on my soapbox and yell about being progressive. And I don't often do that, but I felt compelled, and so I went with it.
I was just going to say that's valid, and I hear you and recognize that experience that you have had. I think as you were talking about it, if there are people listening who also kind of feel the same way about their communities or historical societies or whatever, you can also, if you have access to a library, contact your library or go in and just dig through like their local history collections or whatever. You don't necessarily have to reveal like what it is that you're doing, but you can also certainly, I feel like libraries are much more perhaps neutral spaces. And I remember, especially in the public library, but occasionally happens in the academic library as well, there are always so many people who contact us who live, from very far away, but maybe have interest or connections to the area, that just send an email and they're like, hey, this is kind of what I'm interested in. If you have anything, when you get time, like if you could just send it to me, that would be cool. And I always loved those questions. I mean, 9 times out of 10, they were genealogical, but if you are interested in finding stuff like that, I mean, that's another option. Just because it's not your library doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get help and that, there won't be some resources that can be sent your way.
Yeah, a perfect example was just a couple of months ago, I had to email the University of Cambridge library to inquire about a book that may only exist there, and turns out they can't really help me until the author has passed and the copyright is no longer in danger of getting anyone in trouble with the law. I'm welcome to go visit and read it, but I don't think I'm going to make a special trip to Cambridge University just to read an 8-page paper, but I probably would. No. Anyway, this conversation has kind of taken a turn that I did not expect. I didn't expect to have a more philosophical conversation on the preservation of history and the access that should be provided to you to it.
I love it.
But I want to take it weird. I want to take it weird now, because you said you had some spooky stories about your library.
Oh my God.
I think we'd all enjoy hearing them and getting a fresh drink of water into to wash out the vibes I was putting out a little while ago.
No, and again, like I see and recognize your vibes, and it's important, and that's your experience, and it matters. One last thing I'll say about all of that is that, I feel like we can rectify part of this if we put down our own experiences in some fashion, or feel comfortable sharing them with other people. And I think it was John Tenney that I had heard talking one time about, he was just like, hey, like when you go home for like the holidays, or when you're around, older family or whatever, just be like, do you have any weird stories you want to tell with me? And that's a way of preserving, so just Yeah, okay. But I do have some spooky stories about my library. They came out of a program that I do that I've done every year since 2017. I transitioned it to a virtual program in 2020, of course, but I started doing haunted walking tours on my campus, and every October, and it's just such a fun event for students, but also community members who hear about it. There's also always a handful of faculty members who come and attend. And basically, I just interviewed people around campus, dug into the campus's archives, the archives of the student newspaper, that is, to try to find spooky stories. And even though my campus, the current physical location is not very old, like it was built in like 1974, there are a ton of spooky stories, which I think is cool because it highlights the fact that, not everything has to be a Victorian ghost or whatever.
Yeah.
And one of the stories that I got was about my library. So some of the folks on campus that I reached out to were the campus police because they are there 24/7. And naturally, I was like, they probably have a higher likelihood of having some weird stories. And I was right. And one of them told me about a very scary incident that he had in the library. One evening, it was just after midnight, there was an employee cleaning in the library who saw a male figure walk into the library after it was closed. Obviously, it was closed. It was like after midnight, and walk towards the staff area. And as she was cleaning and saw this, she called out and just said, "Hey, just want to let you know that I'm back here cleaning, just in case they, didn't get spooked or whatever." It's not necessary. It's a little strange, but it's not necessarily unheard of that a library staff member would be in the office that late. I mean, we all have keys, maybe somebody forgot something, maybe they're working on a project. I mean, whatever. It's a little weird, but it's not unheard of. So she wasn't scared at this point. But when she called out, she didn't get a response. And so she just figured, well, maybe they just didn't hear me. No biggie. So she finishes cleaning and goes to leave a few minutes later, and she calls out again to say, "Hey, I just want to let you know I'm leaving." And again, there's no response. And she notices that there's also no lights on, and she doesn't really see where this person might be. Kind of looks around a little bit. And this was on the main floor, by the way, and there's 2 sets of very big double doors on that floor. And you absolutely would hear somebody coming and going from wherever you are on that floor. Because there's also a big atrium in the lobby of the building that echoes those noises that are already pretty loud. She hadn't, seen or heard anybody leaving. And so that's when she got scared. And she was like, there is somebody in here who's intentionally not responding to me. So she walked out of the library and called the campus police. And the gentleman that I spoke to was the one who responded. And he said when he came over, he double-checked the main floor and the top floor and didn't find anybody, but said as soon as he walked down onto the bottom floor of the library, he got that sixth sense that there was somebody there. And he explained it to me by saying that just as a police officer, it's just something that you develop. You just sort of get this empathicness, like in a way, the sixth sense of just knowing when something is off. He didn't mean it in any paranormal way. He just meant, he was like, I knew somebody was there. I could sense it. And he walked all over the floor and didn't find anybody. And so he had this idea to hit the elevator buttons, but instead of getting on the elevator, just kind of tuck around the corner, in the hopes that whoever was hiding on the floor would hear the elevator doors open and close, assume that he had gone away, and come out of hiding. And so he does that. And after the doors close, a minute or two later, he sees one of the lights in the study rooms go on. On that floor of the library, there are 5 study rooms tucked away on like the edges of the floor. And he sees one of the lights go on. And so he's like, oh, okay, like that's where you were hiding. Like, it's a little weird that I didn't see you, but oh well. And he hops over into the study room and there's nobody there. And he said that he tried for like 15 minutes to get that to happen again. The lights in the study rooms are motion activated, but he tried, for like 15 minutes to just wait and see, like, when the HVAC cycled back on again, maybe if it like blew the window shades or something, just enough that it would spark it. That didn't happen. He could not get the lights to come on without physically walking into the room and in front of the sensor. You actually have to walk into the room a little bit for the sensor to even come on, because they face like the interior, they face the inside of the room. And he told me that he never did figure it out. He never found anybody. And that to this day, whenever he has to patrol the library, he turns all of the lights on before he does any patrolling, because he just gets like the biggest heebie-jeebies when he comes in.
What a good story. And also, that is a really good callback to something that we were talking about before we started recording. And that was, you had mentioned how creepy the library is at night. And we got on a little bit of a topic of liminality and energy, and how not only is the library in itself a liminal place and a transient place, it's also lined with books. I mean, the walls are basically books, right? Each book that has been read has had energy poured into it, and emotions and discovery and all of these, human energies just poured into these books and then just put right back on the shelf. And when everyone leaves and it's just you alone in the dark library, you're surrounded by all of this energy that's just radiating from these tomes. Let's get real dark and creepy with it.
Radiating from the tomes.
Yes, I love it.
And but, I think that's part of it. And I also think it's just being in a place that you associate with having people in it, suddenly not having people in it just kind of gives you a little bit of that vibe too.
Right. Yeah, the conversation we had about that earlier was fascinating. And when you brought that notion up, it just sort of like blew my mind. And I started thinking about, the ways that, like you were saying, readers use, these books as objects, and whether they really enjoy it or they really hate it, or they're even indifferent to it. I mean, there's energy that they're putting into it when they interact with these books as objects, and then place it back on the shelf for the next person to pour their energy into it and interact with it. And then also, too, the fact that the authors of many of these books are, you obviously pour your energy into it when you are creating that. I mean, anything that people create, whether it's books or not, there's so much energy that gets poured into creating that thing. But also, there's so many authors that are long dead and gone. And so these books are kind of like little ghosts in their way, They're energies of people that are physically no longer here. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. And part of the reason why books are important. And then also, too, the library as a physical space. I mean, libraries are transitory spaces for so many people. There's always the regulars, of course, who are in, every week or even every day. But there's also a lot of people that, just come and go, and you'll never see them again. And so in a way, the physical spaces are also very liminal environments.
There's something else I just thought about, is that, oftentimes these books will leave the library and go with the person who is planning to read it. And they'll be taken into several different environments across many roads, possibly across moving bodies of water. They're taken on a liminal path themselves, right? These books, and then brought back, and sort of that hero's journey. You set out to do something, you do the something, and then you return. And these books are kind of like heroes too in that way, right? Because they're going on a journey to serve a purpose and then to be returned and celebrated. And it's an interesting thought as well. I mean, it's a nice animist thought, I guess, to apply to library books.
I love that. I'm here for it. I mean, we talked a little bit about that before, but I love that because it imbues more beauty into the book as object. And it made me think when you were talking about that of all the times that I have had to, remove a very, very loved book, a well-used and very loved book from the collection because, it's just falling apart and time to get a new copy. And send that used, very loved copy into its new iteration in this world, whatever form that may take. And I was just thinking as you were talking about how I always really loved those moments because I love encountering those well-loved books that have just been enjoyed by so many people that they're just falling apart. I mean, there's beauty in that.
Yeah.
And I'll also let you in on a dirty little secret. Maybe some librarians listening to this are going to be like, shame, take her degree away, but whatever. It never really bothered me in my libraries. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that I do not work in libraries that have, priceless, like irreplaceable objects, okay? It never really bothered me when somebody maybe absconded with a book. Because to me it was sort of like, you know what, if your day is like made better like by that, but you just like needed that book so bad, I can replace it very easily. You know what I mean? But yeah. I always wondered about what must that book have meant to that person, or how difficult somebody's life maybe might be that they felt the need to steal a library book or something like that. And it never really bothered me as much as it bothered some of my colleagues. And I remember one time, it makes me think of a particular story that a young person had come in and came up to the desk, and I was working, and they asked if I could show them where the self-help books were. And I think this example that I'm going to give you maybe clarifies some of this for anybody that's like raging about that I just said that. But they came up to the desk and they said, can you help me find the self-help books? And so I walked them back to where the self-help books are, which were sort of like tucked away in a little corner of the library. And I was like, well, generally they're right here, but that's a pretty big topic. Can we narrow it down any more? And they were just like, do you have any books about LGBTQ individuals and self-help? And I was like, absolutely, we do. And so walked them over to that section, and pointed out to them. And I was like, here they are, there's no limit to how many you can check out. And they were like, oh, I don't have a library card. And I was like, well, we can get you one. And they were under the age of like 18. And so they were like, well, I can't like check these out on my library card because my parents maybe would know what it is I'm reading. And it became very clear to me that they did not feel safe in having those books like in their home. Yeah. I told that person, I felt so like stricken by that because this person felt safe enough to come out to me in the stacks of the library. And I'd like never met this person before. And I told them, I was like, well, you don't have to check them out to use them. Like, you can just sit here as long as you would like and read them. And then I tacked on too, I was like, and I just want to let you know that we don't have security gates.
That's what I was thinking the whole time was, and then I turned and said, I'm going to be over at the desk, and motioned my head over my shoulder with a wink.
Right. And it was like everything. I just wanted to just take the books and just like put them in their backpack and just be like, peace. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I mean when I say that whenever I knew that a book had gone missing, I always thought about that person. And it never really bothered me if I needed to get a replacement copy of something.
Yeah. It's a sort of take on reincarnation, right? The book has lived its life and now it's back. And a brand new...
Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, sometimes it is irritating when things are like, stolen for the obvious purposes of like being sold and like used for profit or whatever. But
Sure.
I still think about that person. And like you were talking about the energy that people put into interacting with books. I mean, in that person's case, I'm sure that their interaction with that book was a much more intense, energetic exercise than maybe somebody just reading the latest James Patterson.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And I still to this day hope that they took one of the books and put it in their backpack.
I hope so too. I hope they took multiple. I hope they stole tons of books from your library, and I hope that it helped them. I hope it helped them in their life.
Yeah, I don't know how I got onto that topic, but there you go.
It's easy to do. There's also the very distinct possibility that they went outside, got in their friend's car, and said, "The lady in there said we could take whatever we want."
Yeah. Anarchy at the I could see the headlines now. Local librarian tells youth to steal books. Good God.
I think we just discovered the title of the episode, Anarchy in the Liminal Library.
Yes.
Yep.
I love it.
That's going to happen.
Oh,
I love to take throwaway lines from interviews and use those as the title. The last episode that I put out last Friday was Bologna Sandwiches with Valiant Thor, because we were just kind of being goofy and it just kind of came out, and I was like, it resonated with me. I was like, that's the one. I don't always point them out, but this time I'm going to, because it was, I felt like you deserve to know that that's going to be the name of this episode now.
Yes, that's amazing. I mean, hey, it's catchy. If I listen to like lots of podcasts, whenever I see like weird titles, I'm always intrigued. Like, what is this?
Yeah.
It tells me that the podcaster has a sense of humor, and I'm like, yes.
Yeah, for sure. That's the goal.
Yeah.
That's the illusion that I'm trying to present, that I have any sort of sense of humor whatsoever. No.
We're all masters of illusion, right?
Yes, 100%. This has been tons of fun. A lot of great information and a lot of good stories and a lot of really, really good conversation. And I want to give you the floor here for a few minutes, as long as you need, to talk about your books and where people can find them, where they can find you, all of that good stuff, so that everyone can have a little part of your public life.
Wow, thank you. Okay. Well, I am most active on Instagram, and you can find me at liminal.librarian on Instagram, and I would love to have you. You can find my first book titled Researching the Paranormal: How to Find Reliable Information About Parapsychology, Ghosts, Astrology, Cryptozoology, near-death experiences, and more. What a title.
That's a big title.
Yeah. You can find it at your libraries. If your library does not have a copy, insider tip, ask your librarians to get a copy for you. The purchase request forms are often embedded as a link on library websites, by the way, so you don't even necessarily have to go in and talk to anybody. If you want a personal copy, you can get them directly at Roman, ROWMAN.com, from my publisher, Roman and Littlefield. And if you would like 30% off, you can use the code RLF and F for friends and family, RLF and F 30 to get you 30% off. And you could also find it on Amazon. I don't have a code for Amazon, though, unfortunately. And my second book, which is going to be a beginner's encyclopedia of parapsychology, will be out sometime in early 2022.
Fantastic. And I will put links to everything you just said in the description for the episode. So if you're listening to this on Spotify, which as of today, I just learned has implemented a rating system for podcasts. So when you're done doing that, you can look at the description for this episode and just click the links, and you don't even have to type anything in, because that's the kind of guy that I am, and that's the kind of world I want to live in. And you have to be the change that you want in the world. So I provide links for everyone.
That's awesome. Thank you for giving me the space to talk about these things and to promote my work. I'm still very scared and anxious. Like anytime somebody is like, where can I find your stuff? Because it's just such a weird thing still to me to know that there is this thing out in the world that I've written and that people can engage with. And even when I saw your initial post about, hey, if you on Instagram, like if you have a product, let me know. It took me a second to like work up the courage to just self-promote and be like, yeah, I have a thing. And it's like I don't know, the old imposter syndrome sometimes still creeps around, and I also don't have very thick skin, so I just I'm working on being a better self-promoter, but baby steps.
Well, for what it's worth, I've really enjoyed talking to you tonight and having this conversation. And if you can take anything away, I hope that it's when people ask, it's because they want to know.
Yeah, that's good. I should practice what I preach. Yeah. Thank you.
Exactly. Not that you came asking for my opinion on how to live your life, but there it is.
Great. No, I appreciate that. I have enjoyed this conversation very much as well.
All right. Well, with that being said, I think we're going to turn off the patio lights and we're going to head on home, and we'll see you on the next one. Good night, everybody.
Until next time, keep the fire going.